Hey, it's MIT Abstract Day. Let's walk to MIT together. Let's go. What? Plastic on the ground? Oh gosh. Well, good thing we're gonna go meet Katharina. She's designing new plastics for the future.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Fatima, for the wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here today, and I'm really excited to talk to you about engineering new plastics for the future and a little bit about what it looks like for me to work at MIT and try and solve big problems like the general global plastic waste crisis that I'm sure you've all talked about and heard about as you work with your teachers at school and learn about science. So what do I do? Well, one of the big challenges facing scientists in the world today is that there's lots and lots of plastic waste that's accumulating and often going into the environment. And that's obviously something that we don't really want and is something that's going to be a really important challenge to solve in the future. And so I do some work on trying to take a small piece of this problem and make some improvements toward that small piece. Specifically, I look at food packaging, and food packaging is super, super important because it keeps our food safe. It means that we can move food around all over the world and really get food to all sorts of communities and keep it from going bad. So we don't want to get rid of food packaging, especially when it's used to keep us and the food safe and fresh and make sure that it's going to be available to you. On the other hand, a lot of times when we see food or we see waste and litter, on the side of the road, if you can think about that, or spilling out of trash cans outside, or just in general, kind of around in places that aren't trash cans and places that we want to have the waste and collect it, we see that a lot of the waste is food packaging. And that's just because food packaging is something that you kind of use once, right? You use it to keep your food fresh and safe, and then you get rid of it, you throw it away. The same thing goes for if you go to a restaurant, you have your food in a container and then it gets thrown away. And so it's something that is often released into the environment. And so it's something that it tends to accumulate, and we see it a lot as litter. And so we really want to address how we make food packaging that can still keep our food safe and fresh for everyone to use, while also making sure that if it gets out into the environment, and becomes litter, it can go away. And that's the big question I'm trying to answer and solve and try and make some progress towards. But before we talk about how I'm doing that, we need to talk a little bit about how plastics actually look and what they are. So a plastic is a type of polymer, and polymer has two parts of the word, and it means many parts. So I'm sure all of you spend a lot of your day drinking water, and water is lots and lots and lots of little small molecules. It looks like this little picture on the left that I have, where it has oxygen and two hydrogens. And it's not a big molecule. It has three atoms that are connected to each other, but it's not a long chain. And so you put lots and lots of those molecules together and you have, a glass of water or a lake or even the ocean. On the other hand, with a polymer, you have lots of those small little molecules connected to each other. And so that's kind of what this diagram on the right is showing, is that we've linked these individual small molecules, my little characters, together, kind of like they're holding hands in a way that this chain doesn't break. So if you made a big long chain outside with all of your friends and had to move as a group, you would act differently than if you get to run around by yourself. And that gives really interesting, properties to these materials, and it's how we get all the different properties that we use polymers for today, like plastics and food packaging, or your chairs, things in your clothes. All of those are made of polymers. So For me, I then end up trying to figure out how to make new polymers that have these properties that I'm looking for. We'll talk about the properties in a minute, but I first wanted to show you a little bit of how making the polymers looks. And this picture on the left is one I took in lab. And it's basically me synthesizing or making a bunch of new polymers from different materials. It's inside what we call a fume hood, which is basically a little box that we have air flowing through to make sure that the people in doing the research, like myself, stay safe and that there's nothing bad that kind of we breathe in or that we come into contact to. And this type of reaction, I heated up a ton. That's what the little glass vials are sitting in. It's a temperature controlled plate. And then when they come out, they end up looking a little bit like this picture on the right. And you'll see I'm wearing gloves because we don't want to touch these newly synthesized things. But you'll see this little brownish fluid or hard material. I'm actually not quite sure what this one ended up looking like or being like anymore in the right picture. And that's the new polymer made from the new materials that I'm testing. And then we'll take this material and test it in different ways to make sure that it has, or to see what kind of properties it has and make sure it has what we're looking for, or see if it doesn't and if we need to come up with a different material. And so I do two tests mostly that we want to look at for developing this food packaging. And so on the left here, I have a lot of bacteria because one of the things we want to have these polymers do is go away if they get into the environment, right? When they get spilled. And so the way that I'm trying to have them go away is basically feed them to bacteria. And so I want to see if the bacteria can eat the polymers and can get rid of them. And so the test I run puts the polymer or the plastic into these little plates. So the little circles are just little kind of cups that are all connected to each other. And I fill it with this polymer material and a little bit of stuff for the bacteria to grow on. And when it goes away is when you see this color change. So it turns green because the starting things that I made it from, the little guys in that picture where they were all holding hands, are green. But when they're all connected like that, they end up being clear. And so that's where we're seeing this bacteria be able to break those handholds into those small pieces and observe the color change, which is a really cool way to picture the science you're doing. The other test I do is I look at how fast water can actually pass through the material. And that's super important because, you know, just like you don't want your chips getting wet in a package, you also don't want your vegetables going dry in a package. And so by taking the mass or the weight of these materials or the water in a cup that's covered by this material over lots of different time points, I am able to see how fast we're having the water evaporate away. And the things that are a better block for that are going to mean that the mass stays more consistent, whereas the things that aren't as good of a block are going to just lose all the water in that little cup very quickly. And if you've ever left a glass of water out on a table for a couple days or, you know, boiled water for a while, you've seen how this process kind of happens where the water level will keep dropping as the water evaporates away. So I'm just doing that in a scientific way where I'm actually using that, measuring that, and using it to define a property of a material. And so this is a little bit about how I solve these big problems and really and answer some of these big questions that we have in the world today. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what it's like solving these really big, kind of overwhelming challenges, like improving the world's sustainability, and also a little bit about what it's like to try and get into science and how I got started on all of this. And in particular, getting answers to big problems doesn't actually mean that you have to solve the whole big problem. For me, I'm looking at a really small piece of a big problem because there's tons and tons of other people also working to solve these big problems. And that's the really great thing about science and working on things like this, is you have lots and lots of other people to work with that are helping solve your problems, and you're all kind of working towards this collective goal. And so I think the way I look at it is that I'm not trying to solve the whole big picture. I'm trying to make some progress on my little corner of it. And that makes it a lot less overwhelming when I'm trying to, do my experiments and figure things out. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is how I got into science. And basically, I was always really curious about lots of different things when I was growing up. How do you take A and B and get something else, like in this picture? Or how do you recycle plastic? Where does it go? Where does it come from? Or how do you develop vaccines or make human health better? Or how do you have these really complex systems, and how do you understand what's going on in them and figure out how to get from your starting point all the way to your end point? And so that's how I ended up becoming a chemical engineer. It's because chemical engineers solve all of these really big questions or have the skills to work on all of these big problems. And again, that doesn't mean that I'm going to do all of these things. It just means that I can work on little pieces of this, and in the big community, we can make progress on all of these things. And that's what I really love about it. And so just before I finish, I also wanted to show that, I'm not just a scientist. There's lots of other things about me. And so here's a picture of my family members, my mom, my grandma, my brother. And I'm from both the US and Germany, which is really fun and means that I have family kind of all over and have gotten the chance to travel some. This is not our house, to clarify. It's an old palace that we were visiting. We're from a little village in Germany. And then I also really love doing things outside. This is my boyfriend, and we love to do things like kayaking and hiking. I have a cat, and as a lot of you probably have pets, you can understand how much joy they bring. And so she's a lot of my daily entertainment. And then I also really enjoy doing crafty things like this, what you see here, which is like a stitching project that I did this summer. And so that's kind of the end of what I have. And I'm looking forward to getting to talk to you guys and answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Katharina. This is all such cool work, and we already have some really great questions in the chat here. So why don't we get started with that? So our first Nord Anglia student is wondering, how do the bacteria eat these plastics that you're making? What are they doing?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And actually, a super cool part of that is that that's something that people study. It's not something we 100% understand. But what we do know about it is that there's these little things called enzymes, which are like a protein. And if you have an older sibling, you might hear about protein powder. Or maybe you've heard about, you have coaches or somebody who tells you to eat lots of protein. So protein is something you have in your body. It's also something bacteria have, and proteins do lots of different things. And this specific type of protein, the enzymes, are able to break those handholds in the polymer. And so the bacteria make these enzymes, and then they excrete them. So they go out into that little plate area I showed, and they break down the polymer into something green. And that's so that the bacteria can actually take those little pieces and use them for food. Just like when you eat something, they actually also need food to grow and keep living. So it's a way that they're able to digest their food.
That is so cool. That's so neat. Follow up to that. So you're talking about making these special plastics that these bacteria can eat and use as their food. And so we have a Nord Anglia student who's wondering, if possible, why don't we just do this in general? Why do we make polymers out of materials that aren't biodegradable? What's the reason behind that?
So a big reason for it is that we already have lots and lots of ways to make the polymers in different ways. And the big problem now is that if you think about, the plastic or the polymer in your backpack, it's really good at its purpose, or same thing with the food packaging that I kind of work at. And so we have this challenge that we really like the properties that these materials already have. And we're having to come up with things that have these same properties, but are still biodegradable. And having both of those different sides of it has become a really big and important challenge. Because, if your plastic melts as soon as it has sunlight hit it, then it's not going to be great for your food packaging, or all your food's going to be covered in plastic. And so we're facing this challenge of trying to make things both biodegradable and have the same material properties that we already see. And so that's why I'm doing these studies. And that's also why we don't see, biodegradable polymers being used for everything.
That makes a lot of sense. I can't imagine having a picnic outside and the things holding my food start to break down while it's happening. So that totally makes sense to me. We have another question from a Nord Anglia student who I think is very interested in material science and chemical engineering from your talk. And they're wondering, how do you decide, Katharina, which new materials to test in the first place?
So that's also a really big challenge. And actually, a lot of my work has been not making that decision and rather trying to find ways that we can test lots and lots of different things. And so that's maybe where I'll sound more like what you might think of as an engineer in general is, I've built things that allow me to make lots and lots of different combinations of materials that are all very different. And when I say lots and lots, I mean hundreds. So I've made hundreds of new materials, and then I've been working on building new ways to test those hundreds of new materials. And I also have people that I work with that have developed those tests that I get to then use. And so you're right, it's super, super hard to decide what to test, which is why we end up trying to do this approach where we figure out how we can do easy tests on lots and lots of things so that maybe we can pick a few that we want to look at more.
And I think as a follow-up to that, we have a student who has, I think, maybe a computer science interest potentially, because they're wondering, do you expect or see AI benefiting your work and choosing which ones to ultimately test?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, I've used AI to see if we can find any kind of information between the structure, so what I actually build those materials out of or make those materials out of, and the properties that we end up testing for. And so when we do that, we look at if any part of the material structure is having more of an impact on the properties than other parts, so that we know to either not include or to include that part, that structure or that substructure of the material in the materials we end up designing. So yeah, AI is super great in identifying different things and potentially even predicting the properties of the materials if we give it something new that we haven't actually made. So yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's lots of people. This is another thing where, lots of different people are solving different problems. Is there's lots of people in chemical engineering and in other areas that are trying to figure out how we can, further develop AI in making it even better at understanding our materials and connecting that to their properties.
I totally love to see all these really amazing tools coming together to solve this big problem. I think that is just so neat. So we have another question from a Nord Anglia student who's wondering, what kinds of polymers are you using for these? Do they even have names? I'm wondering.
So some of them have names the way you think of them. And if you want to go Google something, you can look up PET, which you might recognize as recycling number one. And you'll notice in that if you look up PET and then go to images, you'll see that there might be a chemical structure that pops up. And in that chemical structure, you're going to have something that looks like it has a circle with two lines underneath connected to another circle. And that is what we call an ester bond. And that ester bond in particular is something that these enzymes can attack and potentially break down. And so when you hear polyester, like in polyester clothing, that's something that's found in those specific materials. And that's the type of polymer that I'm working on. I just use lots and lots of different things in between those ester bonds or those ester groups. And that's what I'm changing. And those are the structural pieces that I'm working on. So they do have names, and they're usually named after the chemicals that are in the material that it makes up. So PET is short for polyethylene terephthalate, which tells me the different pieces of the polymer, and that's what you're going to see in that picture. Is those are the names of the two components. So if you're curious, go on Google and look it up, and I'm sure that your teachers will be happy to talk about it in class and answer questions you have about that.
That is totally so neat. And I agree. That is a little bit of a mouthful, but when you mentioned polyester, I was thinking in my head, hey, I think North Anglia students and I might have something in common because a lot of our clothes might have polyester in them.
Yeah,
So
for
that's
sure.
really cool to know that we're already interacting with polymers every day almost. So that is
Definitely
so,
every day, actually.
yeah.
I bet that if you look around you right now, you can name at least 5 things that have polymers in them.
Oh my
So they're
goodness.
everywhere. And that's why this is such a big problem, and it's such an important problem.
Yeah, that is so neat. I'm gonna have to look around for sure after this. Right now, I'm looking at this amazing Q&A, and we have our next question from a North Anglia student who's wondering, if you found a promising polymer, what would be the next steps in actually bringing it to our grocery stores and actually packaging food with it? What would the rest of that process look like?
Well, if we have a really great polymer that passes my tests, the next thing I'm going to do is see how it mechanically behaves. How strong is it? How flexible is it? How can we process it to turn it into those products? Because that's a really important part too that I don't really look at in my initial screening. I look at these two properties. But if you think about, making tons and tons of packaging or something like that, you're going to have to develop this whole process. The other thing we're going to want to look at, other than those mechanical properties, is how it behaves in contact with food. You might have heard that a while ago there were water bottles that had something in them that really isn't good for people. And so what happened is that these water bottles had this piece in them, and it would get into the water from the plastic bottle, and it would cause problems for people. And so the next thing we want to do is make sure that something like that isn't going to happen with this material, because we don't want the food to not be safe for us anymore if we use it as packaging. So those are the next two things. And then after that, and after it's approved, we can look at how we're going to make it into lots and lots of materials to use.
Got it. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I know what you mean when you're talking about our water bottles, because I see this symbol or words written everywhere that say BPA free.
Mhm.
Would that be
That's
that
exactly what I'm
example?
talking about,
Great.
is BPA, which
Got it.
also is an abbreviation for a name. And I actually use it in some of these materials to see how it does impact what I'm even looking at, because sometimes some of what I use is even bad for the bacteria. And we don't want the pieces of what's in our material to kill the bacteria that might be able to use it as food and actually get rid of it if it gets into the environment.
That makes a lot of sense. That is totally cool. So this actually leads me really well into another question from a student who's wondering, how do you know if you need to use different bacteria for your experiments, and which bacteria do you even choose? How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I don't study, but I do have some friends that study. And so one of them picked the bacteria that I use, and it's one specific kind of bacteria that other people had studied before and had found are really good at breaking down those polyester bonds, those, the handholds, the bonding structure that we're looking at. And so that's what I use to screen. And the way that it had been found is that people tested soil from all over and found that it was really commonly found in soil and compost, which is great because we love to use things that are already all over and might actually be able to, if it gets released, work on and try and digest the polymer that we're putting out. But you're totally right that there's lots and lots of choices. And so I have somebody that I work with who's looking at all sorts of different kinds of bacteria and even fungi that might be able to degrade these materials. And so sometimes I'll give him some of my materials, and he'll test to see how all these other different types of things that he has to test with end up working.
That is really cool. So there is a really big collaborative element to all of this. And I think I'm hearing that over and over, thinking of which materials to test and why, as well as, how do we properly test them? And that leads me to a really nice question, I think from a classroom that's tuning in today. And they're wondering, so is it correct to, summarize this as Do you ultimately test whether these bacteria, that your collaborators kind of study and define, you test whether these bacteria specifically break down the new materials that you are testing?
Yeah, exactly. We're testing very specific bacteria, and we're testing them on our specific materials. And so there's lots of other tests that we'd want to run, like, taking a piece of the material and putting it in soil to see what happens, that we want to do before we say, hey, this is the perfect material. But I think also on that note, there's lots of other people involved. And I really love that about what I do, because I get to work with lots of people who are really good at what they do. And we get to solve these really hard, challenging, and really complicated problems. Because I certainly am not an expert, and I don't think I could be an expert in all of these different things that come together to solve this challenge.
That is really really cool to hear, and I do love that collaborative element a lot, and I think I benefit from as well, and that's also why I love being at MIT, because we have a lot of collaborations here, so that's wonderful. We have a question that is quite interesting from a Nord Anglia student, and I'm going to read it verbatim. Okay. I've heard of making plastics out of corn. Do you know anything about this and what the drawbacks and challenges might be? This seems a little bit different from what you're doing.
So it is and isn't. So I know a little bit about this because when I was in college, so right now I'm in grad school, so that means I already did a bachelor's degree, and I'm now working on another degree. So if you want to do the math, I think I'm in 19th grade. I might be even older than that by now, if you keep counting years. Might be a 20th by now. Anyway, sidetracked. Um, yeah. So when I was in college, I actually worked for a company that made these plastics that come from corn. And there's something in corn called lactic acid. And that's what we're using to make these polymers. They're also polyesters, actually. And so if you sometimes see things around, you'll find that there's a recycling number 7, and sometimes it'll say PLA underneath. And that's the plastic that comes from corn, polylactic acid. And it's a really cool plastic that does lots of different things. And there's a couple ways to make it, but the one that they've figured out how to make tons and tons of is they make this polylactic acid and they turn it into something called lactide, which is just 2 of these polylactic acids connected to each other. And then they use that to polymerize it, which is what we call when we take a small molecule and turn it into these big polymer chains. And from there, they can try and put it into all of these different types of materials. And that's a really great question. And it's one of the biggest bioplastics out there that we can also get from, renewable materials like corn, because it keeps growing, so it's renewable. And yeah, it's super great and super interesting. And there's lots of great work being done on it. And it's one that I also make sometimes, or I use the monomer to test some of my materials. But you're right, I'm not making the exact same thing. I'm trying to find some other materials that might be able to be used in addition to that, because there are limits to what polylactic acid can do. And there are also lots of great things that it does. So we need to figure out how to use it for certain things and how to fill in the gaps with other materials. And we already do that with the plastics we see every day, because there's all sorts of different plastics used for different materials. And if you look, and that's why we have the different recycling numbers, is because they're each labeled by different plastics.
I'm gonna have to look for PLA today after this as well, for sure. I feel like I've read that
Number
everywhere.
7,
Number 7.
recycling number 7.
Got it.
It's the
And
other category.
the other. Okay, that is good to know. And how do you test your materials for their long-term impact in the environment? So things like, how long does it take to actually degrade these if this was, a food packaging on the ground? And how do you determine whether it ends up in our groundwater or potentially hurts plants?
Yeah, so I haven't actually run any of those tests because I'm working on things a little bit earlier in the material development process. But there are lots and lots of people who run tests like that and who develop things like that. And what they do is they actually sometimes bury little samples, little pieces of their material in soil and see how that affects things and see if it goes away. And then they'll take whatever is left in there and actually look at what is in that sample, in that, or what that material has produced as it's gone away. And so sometimes we already know, based on what they find, what that might do to, our water or to the ground. You can also actually grow plants over the sample in the soil to see what it does to plant life. So there's lots of really cool tests that people have developed, and that's how things get certified as biodegradable or compostable, or all these different great things that we look for when we're developing and looking for sustainable materials.
That is really neat. And we have a question from a student who's wondering, changing gears just a little bit, what was the most important class that you took in high school that prepared you for what you're studying now?
So I'm going to say two, which is I know a cheater answer. But as an engineer, I took both physics and chemistry in high school. And that's what got me kind of into being a chemical engineer. And I know you'll probably have to take both of them. But what I do is really kind of in between those two things. And in particular, I'd say physics probably had more of an influence on me, even though I loved chemistry more, because my physics teacher in high school was actually a chemical engineer. He had worked for the Navy and then retired from the Navy and started teaching high school. And he's the one who introduced me to the idea of chemical engineering, and that there's actually a type of engineering that does lots of chemistry, which I really love. So that's how I got started. And that's why I say those two classes, because I found my love of chemistry in one, and I found chemical engineering in the other.
I totally love that. And that is just so cool. I think those are two very good answers to that question. And to follow up, we have another question that's a little bit more about you in the same vein. So this question is actually one of my favorite questions that I've read today. Since you are a chemical engineer, what's your favorite chemical and why?
Ooh, I don't know that oh no, I might have to think about this one. The easiest one that you all know, and is actually very cool, is actually water. Because water does lots of fun reactions. So it changes things a ton. Sometimes actually it causes lots of problems for me. I spend a lot of my day getting rid of water in my polymers and my sample, because we don't want water kind of changing the properties. But, it's also super important for us. And it does some really cool things. So one experiment that you could do at home even is if you have a thermometer and ice cubes and let water be really, really still, you might actually get the water below 0 degrees Celsius, so below its freezing temperature, while still being a liquid, which is one really cool thing. You can also get water to boil below and above, 100 degrees Celsius, which is its boiling temperature. And and it forms really cool structures when it freezes. Plus, it's one of the few things that actually is bigger in volume when it freezes than when it's a liquid, which is super unusual. So it gives us really unusual properties, and it's super important when we're doing testing and lots of different things, in the lab. So maybe water. Plus, we need to drink it to survive. So it's really important from that side too.
I think that's a great answer because that would have also been my answer. It is also my favorite chemical because it's one of the ingredients for life, as you were kind of saying at the end. So I think it is just so neat that it has all these properties. So now I want to zoom out a little bit and just think about some broader aspects of your research and its implications. We have some really excellent questions from Nord Anglia students that are, I think, future thinking. So we have a Nord Anglia student who's wondering, what are the general drawbacks of mass producing these polymers? And do we think they'll be more expensive than the types of things we make now?
Yeah, so that's actually a really, really good question, because it's one of the problems that we're facing is people don't want to pay more because these polymers end up being a little bit more expensive. And part of that is that these other materials have just been around for so long that we've actually been able to decrease the cost of them over time. And so that's going to be a really big challenge, is how do we actually get the price of these materials down, or at least make them comparable in some way to the price of other things so people actually use them. And this is also a little bit how where we can, mention that it's not just collaborations between scientists that are important in addressing these challenges and these big problems, but collaborations between other types of jobs and people as well. There's people that work on policies or actually, making these changes in infrastructure in how we produce them and how we actually are able to transport these things and get them to where we need to use them that are super important in addressing these challenges. And so people, in economics will be able to say better how to reduce the price of these things. And then there's people who work in policy who might actually be able to implement the recommendations that are made by the people doing the economic evaluations. So yeah, it's just a really longer term complex problem that, I don't have a great answer to. And I think it's because we're working on it.
I think, and it sounds to me from your answer that if folks are really interested in working on this problem, but they don't necessarily want to do the chemistry or the science behind it, then perhaps they can work in these other really challenging areas that still get at this big picture problem. So I think that's quite reassuring that there's room for everyone who cares about this to work on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need everyone too. We're not going to get anywhere if, even though I'm a chemical engineer and I love what I do, we're not going to get everywhere if we only have chemical engineers. We need all these different areas too if we're going to actually make these changes.
Absolutely. And so one question we have from a Nord Anglia student has to do again with the kind of life cycle of these materials, perhaps. And they're wondering, you showed us that really cool setup of, the in the fume hood, you have these polymers being synthesized and then these materials being eaten by the bacteria. And they're wondering, what happens if polymers like these end up in the ocean or the sea or a river? Have you tested how they break down if they're just in water?
So some of them, again, like I said, water sometimes just causes problems for me. And sometimes water alone is actually enough to break down these materials. We see it just go away and disappear because those ester bonds that we talked about that I work with will actually react and interact with the water in a way that breaks it apart. But some of them don't do that. So it really depends on the specific material we're talking about and is definitely something we can, look at when we're trying to develop these. Sometimes you may want a material to be super reactive with water and break down in water. And other times, like in food packaging, for me, you probably don't want that because food tends to be a little wet. It has lots of water in it. Thinking about vegetables and fruit and all of those components. And so some of them do and some of them don't. And it's something we can screen for. We can put our samples in water and see how much is left after a while. And longer term, we can also test bacteria that live in water and lots of all the little fun things that live in water that might also be able to break down these materials. So there's lots of different options for figuring that out and for whether or not we actually want that.
That totally makes sense. And now I wonder, I wish I could ask you all the remaining amazing questions in the chat. They're totally wonderful. But I'm going to leave you with a last question. And I gather from this chat, based off of the number of really great science questions that have been asked today, that, there are folks who maybe want to pursue chemical engineering and work on problems in the same way that you do, Katharina. And I wonder if you could leave them with some insight on what are things that they should think about as they pursue their own educations if they want to work on these sorts of problems.
Yeah, I think I think the most important thing is that you find something that you're still really curious about and going to be curious about for a long time. And the reason I like chemical engineering is because it gives me the skills to work on lots of different problems. I just have to kind of choose one and then learn more about it. And the thing that connects all of them is you have to be curious about them. And I think it's important to enjoy what you're doing. And so if you're curious and you enjoy what you're doing, then, going and looking at taking more science and math in high school to prepare yourself for those things might be really good. And there's lots of different types of engineering that help prepare you for looking at different types of problems. So that would be another thing to explore. So, keep asking questions, ask as many questions as you can, and be curious about things and think about how you want to approach problems and what types of problems you want to solve. And I think if you're curious about lots of things and, really want to understand how those things work, then engineering is a good choice. And it's just the type of problem you work on that you're going to change a little bit based on what type of engineering you choose.
I think that is absolutely fantastic advice, Katharina. And I think if today's questions were any indication, they're already on this great path to curiosity in this call. So everyone's off to a fantastic head start. And now, before we close up and leave, I just wanted to remind folks that if you're interested in continuing with our series, we have two fantastic abstracts coming up this season. So I'm excited to see you all there. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone today for asking such fantastic questions in the chat. I'd like to thank Katharina for walking us through her really, really cool work that I'm sure we're all going to be following it really closely in the future. And I also wanted to thank the MIT Nord Anglia Education Collaboration for making this series possible. Thank you again, Kat. This was so fantastic. All right. Goodbye, everyone.